Hey everyone, Father Lane here. Welcome to another class in our course on the prophetic literature. And today we are in St. Petersburg. We have crossed the state of Florida, gone across the Sunshine Skyway, a drive I've made many times, and have come to Tropicana Field. It's appropriate because in 2 Kings we're going to read about how both Elijah and Elisha crossed the River Jordan, cross another body of water, on their way to doing God's work for them. We'll talk about that in just a second. But before we do that, let's talk a little bit about how 2 Kings continues 1 Kings. Like we said earlier, 2 Kings and 1 Kings were originally one book. At some point in the tradition, rather late in the Renaissance, at least in the Hebrew tradition, the book was spliced after the death of Ahab, which is consistent with what we see where books tend to end with the death of a major figure. Think how Genesis ends with the deaths of Jacob and Joseph, and Deuteronomy ends with the death of Moses. 1 Kings ends with the death of Ahab, and so the drama continues with Elijah and Elisha and all the successive kings of both the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. Today we're going to look at three main things that come up in 2 Kings. We're going to talk first about the priests and prophets, especially the prophets that are so prominent in 2 Kings. Then we're going to talk about the succession of kings of Judah, how the southern kingdom experiences a couple of brief renewals, but it's all for naught in the end. And then we're going to deal with the major theological question that 2 Kings addresses, Theodicy. Why does God allow the exiles to happen? We'll treat those in sequence. Let's begin by looking at priests and prophets. As we've already seen, 2 Kings, we have a number of major characters. The kings, of course, are prominent, as the name implies, but notice again in red you've got priests, Jehoiada and Uriah, both of whom give the temple renovations in the south under various kings. Jehoiada also helps with the succession of kings in Judah when there's some palace intrigue, there's some struggles in the succession. That's in 2 Kings chapters 11 and 12. We have the prophets Elijah and Elisha, who are most prominent, but we should also mention Isaiah is going to come up in the story of Hezekiah, and then we'll also talk about Huldah a little bit as well. But let's look at Elijah and Elisha, and we'll begin with the most famous scene of 2 Kings, when Elijah is taken up in a fiery chariot. Let's read how 2 Kings describes it in chapter 2. A fiery chariot and fiery horses came between the two of them, and Elijah went up to heaven in a whirlwind, and Elisha saw it happen. He gripped his own garment, tore it into two pieces, and picked up the mantle which had fallen from Elijah. We often hear in American culture how a successor takes up the mantle of a predecessor. This is where that expression comes from. We've looked here at the climactic scene when Elijah leaves earth and Elisha succeeds him, but there's more than meets the eye. Notice the presence here of a chariot of fire. That's the more literal translation of the Hebrew, rechev esh, and fiery horses. Where else do we see chariots in the Hebrew Bible? Where else do we see fire? And before we answer that question, where else do we see the crossing of the Jordan that I was talking about in the open? Look at what happens right before this incident. We read only a few verses before Elijah is taken up to heaven. Elijah took his mantle, rolled it up, and struck the water. It divided, and the two of them crossed over on dry ground. They're crossing the River Jordan. Whereas after Elisha has succeeded Elijah, here's what happens with Elisha. Wielding the mantle which had fallen from Elijah, Elisha struck the water. It divided, and he crossed over. So we've got chariots, we've got a river crossing, we've got some instrument that's affecting the water crossing, and we've also got mention of fire. Does that remind you of anything? The Exodus, with Moses leading the crossing of the Red Sea with his staff. The staff and the mantle have a similar function. We also shouldn't ignore that there's a parallel here with the River Jordan when the people cross the Jordan River and the river dries up, allowing them to pass through. Notice here, though, that the typology isn't positive. Elijah has to go the opposite direction. He has to go east in crossing the River Jordan. He has to leave the promised land. That's quite significant. And before the book is over, the promised land is gone. There's more to say about the Elijah and Elisha cycles. I'm borrowing this chart from one of the commentaries cited in the bibliography, and you can see how Elijah and Elisha do a lot of similar things. Both console the poor and the downtrodden, especially widows. Also, they serve foreigners. We already talked about how Elijah comforts the Sidonian widow. Elisha is going to heal Naaman the Syrian, a military officer for Syria, of his leprosy. Notice how Elijah and Elisha are the main characters of the centerpiece of the combined book of Kings. And so although we're hearing a lot about the kings of Judah and Israel, the prophets are not to be neglected during this time. And there's more to be said before the end of the book. There's one other prophet we need to talk about, and that is the prophetess Huldah. Huldah is a contemporary of King Josiah. In 2 Kings 22, Josiah has discovered the law, which we think substantially is the book of Deuteronomy. It was found in the temple, and Josiah rends his garments and says, "Oh no, we're going to be cursed because we haven't been following the law." And so he sends to consult with the prophetess Huldah. Here's what she says. "But to the king of Judah who sent you to consult the Lord, give this response: You shall go to your grave in peace, and your eyes shall not see all the evil I am about to bring upon this place." The latter part of that is true. Josiah is dead before the exile happens. But he does not go to his grave in peace. He's killed at Megiddo by the pharaoh Necho in 609 BC. It's a bit of a scandal. One possible explanation is a redaction hypothesis, whereby an earlier edition of the Book of Kings was completed during the reign of Josiah and supported him and spoke well of him. And then a later edition came during the exile and explains why all of these bad things happened. We'll see another example of why we think that is true in just a moment. So let's fill in the gaps in discussing the kings of Judah. You'll notice on this chart that we pick up in the late 8th century with King Ahaz. By this time, the Assyrian Empire is growing in power. Ahaz is a weak king in Judah who ends up facing off with King Tiglath-Pileser III, Pul, the king of Assyria. He aligns with Pul against the northern kingdom and against Syria, against Aram, in what we call the Syro-Ephraimite War. This is when Isaiah begins his prophetic career. King Ahaz eventually gives way to King Hezekiah, who is a good king, and this is now after the northern kingdom is exiled in 722 BC. King Hezekiah, however, faces off against Sennacherib, king of Assyria. We'll read about that in 2 Kings chapters 18 through 20. In 701 BC, Sennacherib threatens the southern kingdom. It looks like he's about to conquer Jerusalem until at the last minute the city is spared. Hezekiah gave way to King Manasseh, who ruled Judah for much of the 7th century. But according to all accounts, Manasseh was a great Assyrian vassal. But that means he worshipped false gods, which to the Deuteronomistic historian is an unpardonable sin, and indeed, God does not pardon it. The exile is Manasseh's fault, according to 2 Kings. After a brief 2-year reign of King Ammon, Josiah, our hero, comes in and reforms the southern kingdom. Josiah restores strict single worship of the one Lord God in the Jerusalem temple. But then, as we just mentioned, he dies, and the denouement is underway. Jehoahaz rules only briefly, then Jehoiakim succeeds him, eventually rebels against Babylon. After he dies, Jehoiakim is captured and imprisoned, and Zedekiah is the last king of the southern kingdom. And that leads us to our final topic, Theodicy. Why did God allow the exile to happen? We read early in 2 Kings, this is in chapter 8, even when one of the kings is wicked, this is set in the 9th century during the Elisha cycle, the Lord was unwilling to destroy Judah for the sake of his servant David, for he had promised David that he would leave him a holding in the Lord's presence for all time. But by the end of the book, after King Manasseh, the exile befell Judah because the Lord had stated that he would put them out of his sight for the sins Manasseh had committed in all that he did, and the Lord would not forgive. So in short, that eternal dynasty ended up not being so eternal. We think that redaction hypothesis helps to explain why that is, but it's an open question. Indeed, it's a question that Israel will continue to reflect on, especially in the Chronicles and in other literature. We'll turn to the Chronicles in our next class. Until then, read well and pray well.